As I have mentioned, David Snowden is a formative force for anticipatory thinking, which is in and of itself a new discipline and a nascent force in science. And his work has been definitive in terms of discussion, analysis of anticipatory thinking as the macrocognitive faculty that he called it. But also, furthermore, he has developed a particular methodology for making sense of multiplicity of voices in anticipatory thinking, naming it appropriately sensemaker. So, David, welcome to our webinar. We're absolutely thrilled to have you. And I would like to start with a more general question about your own interest and how you got to it in anticipatory thinking and sort of foresight, and how you have developed your own methodology. So if you can tell us a little bit about your research trajectory and how you got to developing this particular methodology that is known as your sensemaker.
It's a complex set of origins, I would think, but it probably goes back to when I was director of the Institute for Knowledge Management in IBM. And we were starting to do work on narrative as a disclosure method for decision making. And decision making is a way of understanding knowledge requirements. So it was kind of like knowledge, you can't ask people what they know. It's a meaningless question in a meaningless context. And there was this huge movement at the time for codification of knowledge, which I was deeply disturbed by. So we started, and it was pure coincidence, really. I mean, it worked out really well. Instead of seeing narrative as a method for communication, we saw it a method for disclosure of attitudes, disclosure of knowledge. At the same time, that started to combine with a growing insight into complex adaptive systems theory, which culminated in the Cynefin framework, which is fairly easily available. And that's then started to hit with 2 or 3 major frustrations. So a huge frustration with people who tried to codify knowledge, and with that the whole big data movement, what I fondly call one algorithm to rule them all and in the darkness bind them, right? The failure to realize the role of human judgment. An increasing frustration with scenario planning, because it seemed that scenario planning was producing things which actually never happened, which were really about document read and never led to action, or they were so platitudinous and so high level, nothing worked. And a sort of instinctive belief that you were making yourself more vulnerable by scenario planning because you were reducing your anticipatory alertness, your agility, to see differences. Yeah? And then finally, within the complex adaptive system movement, an excessive focus on modeling. And a failure to realize that human beings aren't ants. I mean, this seems to be fairly fundamental, but there's an awful lot of academic modelers who need human beings to be ants for their models to work. So what I then started to do was combine cognitive neuroscience, the biological end of anthropology, complex adaptive systems theory. It all started to come together, and was then funded around the work we did with DARPA both before and after 9/11, which focused on weak signal detection. So we were looking at things like, for example, human terrain mapping. We were looking for early indications that you had a dispositional situation and effectively give an opportunity for terrorism to rise. Some of the work I'm currently doing on ISIS, for example, looks at the way that the energy cost of replication of ISIS is far lower than the energy cost of replication of, say, Al-Qaeda. And that starts to explain why it's permeating and mutating into different forms. So an awful lot of stuff around there was saying, hang on a minute, guys, we need to sit back, we need to rethink. Yeah? So from that, we moved into the method. So it gives the illustrations. One is fairly prosaic. So one of the things we're doing in hospitals is we're moving sensemaker, which is software which captures continuous, what we call micro-observations. But critically, in the approach we developed and patented, it allows people to self-interpret the micro-observations, generally, for example, into a triangle. So if you ask people about a decision, you don't ask them about the efficacy of the decision because they know what answer you're looking for. You say, in this particular observation, was the decision analytical, principled, intuitive? And what that does is it engages a novelty receptive side of the brain. The brain doesn't know what the right answer is, so it thinks deeper. It literally thinks deeper. It processes about 20,000 items per second rather than 20 million. It's that significant difference. So basically, taking a patient through a journey, a patient is simply recording observations, recording how they feel, and placing that interpretation into a 6 triangle based on theory in the field. So we've got quantitative data. At the same time, we're getting interns to do the same thing for their medical notes. So we got multiple small observations in the before after discharge. If a patient is then discharged and it turns out to have been premature, we can then reinterpret the data with expertise with the benefit of hindsight. So I've got raw observations without knowledge of outcome. I've got reinterpreted observations, and it's a simple bit of mathematics to trigger what's called an anticipatory alert. So that a patient interprets a story, it goes past the threshold. That means look at this patient more carefully. Now, key principle of this approach is we're not to predict the future. We're trying to trigger human beings to a heightened state of awareness when the plausibility of a shift in the overall topology is high. With that, on similar mass capture, we actually got the ads 3 and 2 months early. We had street capture coming in from Cairo, and you could see in the dispositional landscapes, this was distributed ethnography, a culture scan, not looking for counterterrorism, it's a culture scan. You could see the dispositional landscape was stable on the surface, but it was multiple instabilities, which actually in mathematical terms means a stall event will create a catastrophic change. So body of tools and techniques around that. And then the second area, we've just completed this in Singapore. We'll be publishing the results tomorrow online, where we looked at both an ISIS situation, which we won't publish, but we looked also at the Greek exit. So we basically presented situations in real time to networks of experts working independently of each other and got them to assess that situation from multiple backgrounds. And what that gives us is a dispositional map which shows how different groups of people from different backgrounds are interpreting the same situation. So we get rid of the cognitive bias associated with workshop scenario planning by moving into what's called a mass human sensor network. So there's a body of tools and techniques about that, but they're really fundamentally taking what we know from natural science. And sort of a final slightly tongue-in-cheek comment, I'm on my first degree is physics and philosophy as a joint major. That taught me to have a contempt for social science from 2 completely different disciplines, which I'm still trying to overcome. But within that, the foresight community is heavily into a model of causality, which just isn't the case. So a long answer, but you asked a big question.
Yeah, thank you so much. First, as you have taken us from where the impetus came for devising and designing something like this all the way to the possibility of its applications, because you gave a couple of concrete examples. One of the powerful things that I hear is that the development of your own anticipatory framework and thinking along with the methodology of the sense maker comes from a powerful interdisciplinary complex interaction and interface between multitudes of disciplines, from narratology to psychology to neuroscience to strategizing, decision making, political background, and it's a truly impressive span of disciplines that you wove together and conjoined, which automatically, just so you know, aligns itself with the programming in the World Academy, where we have plainly put that the complex and complicated world that we live in requires interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research, because we cannot address the crises, multifaceted crises, in a siloed off manner. So that we have to have breadth of vision along with depth of inquiry to address it. And we share exactly the same affinities and an understanding that it's impossible to use the same methodologies and reasoning that way. So in one sense, that's what you're bringing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was just saying, one of the things I was at Stellenbosch this week at the centre, we're now moving out on the level, so we're looking to combine epigenetics which is the chemical activation or deactivation of DNA, which is largely driven by symbols in human with horizontal information. Some of the modern stuff on constructor theory and physics, which looks at the bounds of physical reality, then looks at energy costs. So I think the fascinating thing about this is there are many disciplines. We're now starting to put complexity with evolutionary biology, with holistic models of physics, with anthropology, and that really is exciting. The trouble is people still try to do transdisciplinary work in silos and then have a conversation. What they don't do is try and find a higher level of abstraction through which they can integrate the knowledge bases, and that's what's really interesting when you start to do that. Sorry, I interrupted you, but
no. This is a true dialogue where we're layering our discussion. What you hit another very powerful nerve, kind of a vital nerve as far as World Academy is concerned, which is also an understanding that you start from abstract enough, wide enough perspective to create a framework through which you would then enter a particular situation with proper understanding, which is, again, another way of a powerful, broad enough approach that the World Academy has been applying in our programming, particularly in terms of values, theoretical framework, a particular scope of understanding and perspectival position that allows you to see the complexity, the networking, the inner working of our larger system and its interdependent circuits. So this is very, very powerful. One of the things that I want to point out for our audience, as well as have you discuss in more detail, is that you outline what we have so far had in foresight, in the so-called forecasting and then foresight and anticipation, that has been basically modeled through decision-making, scenario-making, and modeling. And you point out the shortcomings of those methods, and talking about the reductive way in which they actually affect us and reduce our perspective regarding what can be done. So this is something that I greatly appreciate. And in my own discussion at the last anticipation webinar, I have spoken about fundamental difference between event and experience. And this is where the notion of narrativization is very important, that I would like you to discuss more. Event is something that happens to us, and experience is the interpretation of that event as later on becomes the basis of derivative of knowledge and informs future action and future reaction to events. So I kind of situate in anticipatory thinking exactly in the interstice, in between, in that interval, in this kind of irreducible space between event and experience, when we retell that story of our life back to us that informs our belief, our worldview, our mental framework through which we act in the future, and through which we're only capable through that framework to anticipate further. So the first question for you is if you can kind of address that notion of an interpretation and translation that happens in between event and experience, along with the power of narrativization, which you recognized as the storytelling that we use in the process of interpreting the world to ourselves, to others, and as well as create a virtual worldview for the future making.
Yeah, I think one of the key things which comes out of complexity theory is that interactions matter more than things. So actually, if you look at it in terms of the context of political philosophy, complementarianism wins out over social atomism. We're far more defined by our interactions with other people and with physical objects. I mean, this concept of conniving, which is actually a physical rootedness as well as a social rootedness, is key. Now, if you start to look at that, that means multiple interactions over time are starting to define the way we interact with the physical world, which is not the same thing as social constructivism. So if you look, let's take a Deleuzian concept of an assemblage, which basically says that, you know, as people interact over time, something forms. Yeah. Now, if you look at Delander's realist account of that, which is brilliant, he says that as it reaches a critical mass, which is a fitness landscape in complexity, it then has existence independent of its creator, and it applies downwards causality. Now, that to me is actually a modern interpretation of a trope. And I would use trope. I would reject all concepts of memes. In fact, no geneticist takes Richard Dawkins seriously, because the idea you've got a linear causality from a unit, whether it's a gene or a mean, is just really bad science. So if we can understand the tropes which are in operation, then you can either disrupt a trope or you create an alternative trope. But the key thing is to realize that it's not about individual mental models. It's the fitness landscape of tropes in navigating the world. And that's the point about community cost. So by actually hitting Al-Qaeda, the net effect was to create a landscape which allowed ISIS to actually replicate and mutate, at a much lower energy cost. And some of the scenarios are not so dangerous. So the strategy for something like that is to increase their ideology, not to decrease it. Because if you increase their ideology, you put them into an energy well, and then the mutation rate goes down. Right? So I think, I'm talking about similar things, but with slightly different language, I think. Because we need to start to actually, and this is the sort of mass mapping, you need to understand the dispositional landscape over multiple interactions and realize it's constrained by physical reality, and that's the key realist concept. So what are the physical constraints? But then within the physical constraints, what tropes can propagate fastest and what can mutate fastest? And what level of stress you're putting on the system, because if you put stress on the system, mutation rates go up. And therefore you've got less controllability. Now, I may not have answered the question, I may have answered a different question, but that to me is actually, I think, where we're working, because that gives us the ability to do genuine anticipation, but not to anticipate. I mean, what matters is anticipatory triggers and awareness of dispositional states, rather than anticipation itself. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yes, sense making for sure. What I just want to address real quickly is this notion of trope. When I discussed the notion of interpretation and translation, I said this is a matter of representation, and it's largely an aesthetic process because of that. Then I took the notion of representation further into institutionalized representation in the politics, which you are now taking further. So it's sort of as a provocative opening into the discussion of anticipation. I spoke about what you've spoken about as the evolutionary potential of the present, that I found it at the interstices between representation, aesthetic, and political. So it's a powerful aperture here for discussion that we don't have time. This would probably take the entire conference, and that's why we're having the Trento conference that Roberto Poli, another formative force, is organizing for us. But the notion of alternative trope is exactly key, vital to the programming of World Academy and what we have in somewhat of a cliche, but for the sake of recognition, called as the development of the new paradigm, because we need to replace the old paradigm with a new vision and sort of and build it up in a way that it can take over.
And that requires us to shift to abstraction first. It's the same as the transdisciplinary point. So the work we're about to start on FARC negotiations with the Colombian government is about changing the abstract level of understanding of the past rather than the concrete understanding of possible futures. And it's interesting, human language evolves from abstractions. Cave painting comes before language in human evolution. So anything which is a physical word, this is the danger of data analytics, is a partial concrete manifestation of an abstract concept. And one of the ways you change tropes is you shift the tropes to a higher symbolic level of abstraction and allow them to recombine in a novel form. Now, that's early days on that. But the key thing is you don't address problems directly, because then you enforce current attitudes. And anybody with teenage children knows that anyway. But I think we're now starting to understand more of the theory behind it.
That kind of change requires dramatic, pun intended, dramatic reconfiguration. What I mean by that is also changing the mental relief along with political or geostrategic relief. And I intentionally say configuration because the notion of troping or figuration is key to it. One of the powerful aspects...
is interesting. We're now starting to see a biological explanation of Kuhnian paradigms. So we're actually, it's a big conversation on this week, that basically a paradigm shift is a symbolic shift. And DNA follows symbols in human evolution because symbols are vertically and horizontally transmitted. And DNA catches up, and the epigenetic side catches up even faster. I think one of the things we're starting to see, as through a glass darkly, to quote the Bible, right, is the possibility of understanding a realist account of a Kuhnian paradigm shift in terms of our capacity to make sense. Now, at a micro level, that gives you another intervention technique. So a Kuhnian paradigm works at a macro level, but can you make it work at a micro level?
Fantastic. Another strand of our research and programming is consciousness and values, which is exactly what you're addressing. So, Gary, I would like to invite you to join us and share what I can see you busily and excitedly have been jotting down.
No, well, I'm welcome this opportunity, and I'm enjoying listening to the discussion. And at this point, I would like to remain listening. I'd like to learn more about what David has to share with us. So please continue.
Thank you so much. Yes, but as I was reading some of your work, such as Naturalizing Sense-Making, Anticipatory Thinking, as well as sense-making in a complex and complicated world, what was truly impressive is the range of which you speak as this, as I mentioned initially, macro-cognitive faculty. In the process of it, you, as well as I have mentioned in my own presentation, Anticipation, take anticipatory thinking on a full spectrum, from certainty to uncertainty, from projecting, forecasting, to foresight, to innovation, creation, all the way to envisioning, of which you kind of address through the shift in troping, high enough, abstract enough, shift in tropes and figurations. So this spectrum is very impressive, and I understand, and please clarify, that is how you see this macro cognitive on a full scale of capacity to foresee and envision, as well as multi-layer, what I have spoke also of as multi-temporality, because we inhabit multiple temporalities as psychological time, as well as clock time. So we have multi-temporality, multiple regionality, or also psychogeography, along with full spectrum of our cognitive capacities that you are trying to conjoin. If you can address that notion of macrocognitive faculty, anticipation as such, on the one hand. On the second hand, how can we develop and cultivate that kind of, through, say, education or research, or through your methodology? How can we develop that faculty further and cultivate it? And it's sort of I always ask the question, what kind of human being is capable of upholding such paradoxical and complex perception? And if you can tell us how you envision, probably, say, future of education and research in that sense.
Okay, I mean, that's a huge question, and I'm already starting to think of some questions I haven't thought about before, so I accept this as a provisional statement. I think one of the research programs we're hopefully going to start at Bangor this year, the new Centre for Applied Complexity I've set up, is to look at, can we extract archetypal symbols from cultures around the world? So can we move from symbols in use to archetypal forms of symbols, and can we use choreography techniques, because that is symbolic, effectively to create a meta-language across cultures, both designed for interpretation across cultures, but also designed to actually allow what I call necessary difference, because I think one of the big mistakes people make in peace and reconciliation is they don't emphasize boundaries. So one of anthropologies says if people actually are similar, they're more likely to conflict than if they're radically different. So the attempt to homogenize people is actually a mistake. And one of the big issues here, if we look at the theory of change, is the theory of change based on action. So if you go back to the 70s, when I and others were involved in peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland, all 6 counties, depending on your background, you call it something different. There were 2 approaches. One was the Corrymeela approach, which I fondly call New Age fluffy bunnydom, which got people together from both communities to have deep conversations about how they shouldn't throw stones at each other, and got a lot of funding. Yeah, and then people, after these wonderful workshops, went back and sooner or later started to throw stones at each other because nobody addressed the context. Yeah, the identity structures were different in the workshop, because entry into a workshop is a ritual that changes identity. The other approach, which was associated with Glen Cree, which I was linked with, was to take people from both communities and send them into Latin America in joint teams for a year or so. And what we did, and again, I now know some of the biology on this, getting people to act differently changes their perception. Getting them to talk about their perception is far less effective. Right? So a lot of our work, for example, on theory of change, is more stories like this, fewer stories like that. Not how you change your attitude, but what will you do tomorrow to create more like this, less like that. Right? And I think that what that means in future direction of change is we've actually, it comes back to stuff we talked about already on symbols. We've got to look at ways in which we can shift to a higher level of abstraction in the way we talk about disciplines and the way we talk about the world. Because at the moment, our languages are far too, they're either concrete or they're fluffy bunny. Yeah, they're just strings of platitudes. And big criticism I got to people like Peter Senge and Arthur Sharmaga is they've adopted what I call a form of post-colonialism. And they've made decisions about what sort of people need to be for the world to change, and that is actually, apart from being ineffective, I don't think it's ethical. Right? So we've got to find a way in which we can create an abstract level that allows communication, but which we can also allow people to have distinctive boundaries around culture, which enable those cultures to coexist and interact and co-evolve without those boundaries becoming conflict-based boundaries. Now, I think that's a transdisciplinary research program of huge importance, and it's not currently being realistically addressed. People are talking about mental models, they're talking about changing individual attitudes, they're talking about concrete, tangible financial issues associated with political change. Now, all of that sort of is useful, but if you don't change the way that people perceive their past and present, there isn't a future possibility anyway. I mean, it's a very American concept to say we manage the present by defining an ideal future. If you look at the stories in Latin America or Asia or Africa, there's stories about the present, past and present, and until you change those, people won't tell stories about the future. Now, again, I've rambled a little bit around this, but it seems to me the research agenda at the moment is not doing the pure science, it's doing the applied science. And it's doing the transdisciplinary work is currently in applied science without the pure science having been done first. Yeah? And that is a paradigm shift, even within those who think there should be a paradigm shift.
Thank you for affirming. Thank you for the
question, because I haven't thought about it like that before, so that was really useful.
Thank you.
Mila, I do have a question for Dave.
Go ahead, please, Gary.
Okay. If it's not disrupting your flow and direction, because I'm not...
By all means, go ahead.
You have your own... Okay. You've been talking about theory of change, and you've been talking about transdisciplinarity. If we talk about the social sciences comprehensively, inclusively, all the way from business at one end, I understand you do some consulting to business, to economy and processes on the other. Do you think there is a fundamental principle? When I think about transdisciplinarity, the word lends itself to many different uses. But when I think of it, I think of processes and principles that transcends disciplinary boundaries, that would actually be a unifying substructure for activity, human activity in any field. I'm confining it to human at this point. Does your work and thought focus on such a process or such principles?
Yeah, I don't think we use quite that language.
The opening remark that Okay, well, that's fine, but go ahead. Your opening remark, which I heard when I came in, the interaction matters more than the things, itself is a transdisciplinary conception. That's what I was smiling about, because it has great implications.
I mean, if we look at some of the work we've done at the moment, all right, and we're now starting to work on transdisciplinary material, and there's an interesting program we're about to start if the funding comes from California or on academic journals. So the concept is people will index papers or paragraphs in papers into the symbol sets we created for anticipatory awareness. Right? So I'm not putting it with keywords or putting it into categories, I'm associating it with 4 or 5 abstract qualities. Yeah? What I can then do is I can draw a fitness landscape from that at the level of abstraction with attractor wells in it. So if the abstractions from different disciplinary notes start to come together in an attractor well, I know those sort of things are working at the right level of abstraction. And what that allows is a biological process of acceptation, which is key to transdisciplinary work. So acceptation, linear adaptation, is a dinosaur's feathers adapt over time for flight. But then they, as a non-linear acceptation, they evolve in a linear way over time for warmth or sexual display. And there's a non-linear switch to flight. Right? The human cerebellum is a linear evolution to manage muscles in fingers, which then is a non-linear acceptation of grammar, i.e. grammar couldn't happen in a linear way. So what we're now experimenting with is how do we create acceptive clusters between fragmented observations from different disciplinary backgrounds. So that's one method to address the sort of thing you talked about. Yeah, and again, it's moving to abstraction, it's moving to large-scale linkage associations before you get human mediation of the output, if that makes sense.
Okay. If I've understood you correctly, you are addressing the cognitive aspect of human behavior, which would be transdisciplinary.
Yeah, and the cognitive pattern of sense-making, i.e. how do we integrate concepts or ideas, and it's done by fragmenting the concept and abstracting the interpretation, then reconnecting in novel ways.
So this issue of, that's very interesting to me, the concept of fragmentation and integration. Do you see in some way that those two functions are somewhat, they are fundamental to the way our minds work, regardless of what the subject is?
Yeah, it's a thing called conceptual blending, right? The way we make decisions is a partial data scan, and then we blend together fragmented memories from multiple backgrounds. So what we're doing is effectively creating conceptual blending at a mass community level, rather than individual level.
So we divide a reality into pieces, and then we try to put it back together in some way.
Yeah, it's back together again. The granularity in you've got to have coherent units, all right? The measurement of coherence is key on this. And if you look at what we're doing on scaling development success for the UNDP, you don't scale by imitation. You scale by fragmentation, recombination, and mutation. So the Grameen Bank cannot transfer from Bangladesh to Africa. It has the concepts or the fragments around the Grameen Bank to reassemble in an African context. And that's a similar sort of field. But it's not just fragmentation or decomposition. You're finding coherences within the system. Yeah, and coherence is a non-reductionist. Categories are reductionist, coherence is a non-reductionist.
And how would these coherencies, this looking for coherencies, relate to the principle of organization as a mental activity to relate things that have been separated from one another?
I think it does that because what it does is it presents novel combinations, right? There's an interesting argument that we need to increase the physicality of the connections, because physicality is key to human cognitive process. So at the moment we're doing it virtually, one of the things I'm looking about is how we increase the physical interaction with the recombination. Right? And that's also part of it. Right? The other issue then, we talked about this earlier, what we call mass sense, is how you get multiple perspectives on a recombination in real time, so that you can see common patterns, but also you can find outlier patterns. Because in a complex adaptive system, you're seeking for outliers as much for commonalities. I said that there's a complex interweaving there, and I think we can see how to do it, but we haven't quite done that yet. That's the next stage.
Just one more question, Mila, and because I don't want to, but I don't know if you've mentioned to Dave about our new economic theory project.
Not yet.
But one of the projects of the Academy is trying to reconceptualize what social science theory or economic theory, and I think this very much the basis of it is to understand cognitively how we conceptualize theory, and what is the paradigm, the cognitive paradigm that has given us the theory we have, and what would be the fundamental characteristics of a paradigm that's truer to life or more effective or more, depending on the way we want to define the outcomes we're looking for.
That, I think, is hugely important. And I think one of the things that, I was having a big conversation about this in California last year. One of the projects we're about to run is called Children of the World, and the concept is to have every 14-year-old in every school in the world gather narratives from their community every month. Now, one of the ideas on that is that potentially gives us, and we've almost got the World Bank, but we're looking for 2 or 3 funders, we're getting there. And we've already done that in 5 countries. We've done it in Libya, we've done it in Cairo, we've done it in Colombia, we've done it in the UK, so we know how to do that. One thing that I'm interested in is, can we start to look at new forms of value in connectivity between people and ideas, so that we're not reliant on effectively money or Bitcoin, because both of them mediate exchange through a tangible object or algorithm. So can we change the medium of exchange to be an interaction, not an object? And that's kind of like barter completely reconceptualized. And I think unless we can switch the world in that direction, if I take it from a political perspective, I can see absolutely no reason why we can't give free at the point of education, free at the point of entry healthcare. Because we've got the professionals, we've got the skills, we've got the resources, but we create this monetary rationing technique which creates systems which are totally perverted in their nature.
Which we not only do with education and healthcare, but we do it with everything necessary for survival and human welfare. We have the capacity, society has the capacity to deliver all of it. But
I think it's
the paradigm...
It's a cockroach conspiracy, because when we die out, they're going to take over the planet, all right? But I've read Philip Rothton.
Thank you, David. Thank you for your enthusiasm and for creating such a lively discussion. I can see that Gary's excited about it. And once again, I'm going to say that it is really thrilling to see the webinar take a true nature of forum and a dialogue rather than formal presentation. One of the things that you have said that is very powerful is this problem between homogenizing discourse as opposed to creating a genuine and powerful conceptual blend of mass community at a mass community level. How do we not slip into homogenizing and leveling while we're trying to create a more unified vision, or should I say retell the human story, this human story of welfare, of well-being, of wisdom, and the human development, while we're not effacing the differences? In other words, how do we translate conflict into diversity, into productive contrast rather than conflict? So it's a powerful concept that it's kind of walking a very, very thin line that you address. And I'm very grateful that you did address education in that sense. So you know, I know it's a big question. I know this is something in the making, and we in the Academy are thinking about future of education as well as education for the future. So if you want to address in any way how you possibly envision what the future education would look like, and I understand that's a massive question, I would also like to add to that the next thing that might bring us to some kind of wrap up of the discussion, because I don't want to take too much of your time. It is the last question would be more about what have been the most productive critical points about your own work. What have you heard in terms of criticism of your work that is still gnawing at you productively, that is provocative enough to keep you going? So on one hand, if you would like to give us a sense of how do we do research and education from this point on, as you mentioned, children 14-year-old that are gathering different stories, they're registering their stories. On one hand, pitch us forward, as well as forward into your own research and what keeps you going at this point through a productive critique.
Okay, well, slightly tongue-in-cheek, I think we need a mass distinction event for idealistic consultants and academics, right? Because that's part of the problem. Yeah. I think on education, there are several things, but two things I point out. One of the things we're doing with children of the world is not to get children to tell their own story, but to act as journalists into their communities, which means we can initiate events. And the concept there is peer-to-peer knowledge flow across barriers. Yeah? So a kid gathering stories from, say, their grandparents about farming practices in Ethiopia, then finds stories about farming practice in Ethiopia, I think with water conservation in Colombia, and comes out with a novel form of action, which doesn't have to be mediated through the development agency. So that's one of the goals of that sort of program. I think the other thing is I'm getting absolutely pissed off with people who actually take criticism to be an attack. Yeah. There's this whole school of people who don't want anything to be criticized. Right? So when I grew up, right, one of the things we did in Welsh grammar school, they don't do it anymore, but I would bring it back in schools all over the world. Yeah. You don't teach people transdisciplinary because that gets a curriculum, which is a nightmare. You put people into situations where they have to be transdisciplinary. Now, what happened with us is, class size of 25. We were lucky in that every day, I mean, my day was Monday, 5 students. You'd have to stand there, one after each other. As you stood up in front of the class, you were given a card, and it would say something like, "You support capital punishment." And you had to speak for 7 minutes without preparation, and you were marked on it. Yeah? Now, I have despised people who support capital punishment. But then having to argue a case you didn't believe in, you then read newspapers, you read books, you moved around. Yeah, it was and it comes back to your point about process, Gary. It was a very small process, yeah, which changed the way you interacted, so that we actually, I mean, that my generation, Bass and others, were all generalists, partly because of that process. The assumption was we did it, right? So I think, and ritual is important on this. I mean, one of our techniques, ritual descent, ritualizes a process of mass attack on somebody's ideas, and everybody enjoys it. So I think one of the things we've got to do is to legitimize the right sort of conflict. Those people who are attempting homogenization of mental models are actually creating the preconditions for far more significant conflict than we currently have. Right? So this sort of peer-to-peer rapid knowledge flow of ideas across contexts, the economic stuff you talked about, Gary, is also important to that. But legitimizing and ritualizing conflict will actually allow us to exist in a world which doesn't require homogenization. So those would be some ideas.
Okay. And thank you very much, David. I am particularly grateful for affirming some of my thinking and my messing with these concepts when you spoke about reinventing symbols, even archetypal, registering and collecting archetypal symbols as this kind of meta language across cultures, and reinventing the myths for the 21st century, as I have I have a performing side to my interest, as well as I've been doing, as you say, choreographing. That is exactly, performing arts is my another interest and my great passion. And that's where this notion of the great dramatic representation of those stories is very, very important, and that's what I'm striving to do, which we will see exactly in the rise of media, independent media, documentary making, reality, new type of reality shows, as well as makeshift theater, as well as massive, globally orchestrated, simultaneous performing events that are happening across the globe. Sort of these new initiatives that are happening in the street. As I always say, we're catching up with what is happening in the streets already. So this is a very, very powerful trend that is already taking place in the public, in the agora of the world. So I appreciate you bringing that in, which also brings in the invalidates arts and humanities and conjoining them with sciences and precision with which you speak in research. So thank you very much for a powerful conversation. We are absolutely excited to have you, and especially knowing that we'll have you at the first International Conference on Anticipation at the University of Trento, November 5th through 7th, where we have two separate panels, each with 3 sessions in them that WAS has organized. And we are delighted to have you in a special session with Mark Swilling, where you will have time to discuss further your research. Exactly. So if you have any concluding comments from you or for Gary, I'm very appreciative of this time, very appreciative of a kind of a very informal but immensely productive and exciting discussion that we had today. Gary?
Thank you for making me think. It's appreciated.
Well, you certainly made me think. Well, I look forward to meeting you at Trento, Dave, and thanks very much for your time.
Great. Okay.
Thank you, David.